In a quiet mansion in Japan, a Russian maid did something no doctor or teacher could. She taught the heir of a dynasty to speak again, in 5 languages. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from.
Irina stepped out of the taxi just as the morning light broke faintly over the horizon. The towering black iron gates of the Takeda estate loomed before her, flanked by moss-covered stone lanterns that seemed to guard the entrance like silent sentinels. She paused on the curb, gripping the handle of her worn suitcase, and allowed herself a moment to study the mansion beyond the gates. It was beautiful, but not in a way that invited you in. The wooden structure rose like a solemn temple, its dark tiled roof and precise, understated lines evoking the weight of generations. The faint scent of cedar and incense wafted on the cold air. Even from here, she could sense it. This was a place where joy had long been banished. A woman in a stiff black kimono, the head housekeeper, appeared at the gate and gave Irina a quick, shallow bow, gesturing for her to follow. Not a single word of greeting, no question of her name. Just that brisk nod and averted eyes, as if Irina were just another piece of furniture being delivered. Inside, the hush deepened. The polished wooden floors gleamed under soft golden lanterns. Shoji doors slid shut behind her with a sound like a sigh. The only things breaking the silence were the faint tick of an ornate wall clock and the muffled steps of servants, all moving efficiently, their eyes low. Not one of them acknowledged her presence. She was invisible here, but she had already expected that. In the narrow dressing room, she found her uniform folded neatly in a wooden box, a black dress with a crisp white apron, long sleeves, heavy black tights, and soft-soled shoes. She ran her fingers over the fabric and smirked faintly at her reflection in the mirror. "I never thought I'd wear something like this. Feels like I've stepped into an anime." Her laugh was small and hollow. She tied her hair into a strict bun, slipped into the uniform, and squared her shoulders. Whatever she had once been, whatever she had lost, none of that mattered here. Here, she was just another maid. When she entered the great hall for the first time, the mansion swallowed her whole. The space was vast, with vaulted ceilings and intricate calligraphy scrolls adorning the walls. Swords and ancestral masks hung like watchful eyes. But despite its grandeur, the room felt oppressively cold, as though it had been sealed off from warmth long ago. She dropped to her knees and began polishing the hardwood floor, her hands aching from the chill that seeped through the cloth. Halfway through her task, she sensed movement. On the staircase stood a boy, small and slender, with neat black hair that fell across his forehead. He wore a pristine school uniform, his fingers clutching a notebook. His dark eyes studied her silently. Irina froze, meeting his gaze. But after a heartbeat, he turned and vanished into the shadows of the corridor, soundless as a ghost. And then she noticed someone else at the top of the stairs. Kenji Takeda, the patriarch. He stood tall and still in his immaculate charcoal suit, one hand on his phone, the other clutching a leather briefcase. His expression was carved from stone, but for the briefest second, his eyes drifted toward the boy retreating down the hallway. A flicker of something, maybe regret, maybe nothing at all, crossed his face. Then he straightened his tie, adjusted his cufflinks, and disappeared behind a shoji door without a word. Irina exhaled slowly and returned to scrubbing the floor. She didn't know their names yet, didn't know the story, but she recognized this kind of silence. It was the same in every language.
The rest of her first day unfolded in the same muted rhythm. The mansion was alive with quiet movements and yet utterly dead at the same time. Servants passed by her,
nodding perfunctorily, never meeting her gaze. The only sounds were the faint sweep of brooms, the sliding of doors, and the endless tapping of rain against the paper windows. In the kitchen, she caught whispers, fleeting words in Japanese she couldn't fully catch, but she didn't need to. She knew what they were saying. About her hair too light, her skin too pale, her presence too foreign. She was used to it. By mid-afternoon, she was assigned to dust the library. The door creaked open into a sanctuary of books and silence. The smell of old paper and varnished wood enveloped her like a memory she didn't dare name. Shelves rose from floor to ceiling, lined with leather-bound tomes and children's picture books alike. It was here, as she dusted a high shelf, that she felt it again, that quiet stare. Turning slightly, she glimpsed him, the boy, seated cross-legged in the corner, his notebook open in his lap, his eyes fixed on her, watching, always watching. Irina offered a faint smile, but he did not respond. He simply closed his notebook and slipped behind one of the shelves, his small footsteps silent against the tatami mat. When she finished her work and stood in the doorway, she caught sight of him at the end of the hall, still observing her, still saying nothing. That night, back in her tiny room at the edge of the estate, she sat on the futon in her uniform, staring at the faint glow of the moon through the paper window. Her body ached from the day's work, but her mind was elsewhere. The boy's silence weighed on her, heavy and familiar, as though it echoed her own. The way he watched her, not with contempt like the others, not with curiosity even, but with something more fragile, something closer to hope. And his father. Kenji Takeda was already gone before sunset, off to whatever meeting kept him away from his son and this house full of ghosts. But Irina had seen the moment at the staircase, that split second where the man's mask cracked and he almost looked back at the boy. Almost. She lay down at last, pulling the thin blanket over her shoulders, and closed her eyes. Invisible, she thought, her lips forming the word without sound. That's what they all want me to be, invisible. But the boy, what did he want? That was a question that lingered in the darkness. The days that followed revealed the truth to her in fragments, murmured conversations she overheard, solemn glances exchanged between staff, and her own quiet observations. Everyone in the house knew the story. Everyone except her. The boy's name was Haruto Takeda. He was 7 years old, the only heir of the Takeda family, a name that carried weight across Japan, thanks to the sprawling automotive empire built over generations. But even such a mighty name could not shield him from tragedy. 2 years earlier, on a rainy February evening, Haruto and his parents had been returning from a family gathering when their car was struck on a mountain road. The driver lost control on the slick asphalt. The vehicle skidded and slammed into a barrier. His mother died instantly. He survived. Physically unhurt, at least that's what they said, but ever since that night, not a single word had passed his lips. The mansion's older staff whispered of the day he returned home wrapped in a blanket, his small hands clenched around a torn ribbon from his mother's hair. He sat silently in her lap one last time in the hospital before she was taken away. And then, nothing. They had called it selective mutism at first, then trauma-induced aphasia. Every possible name had been given to his silence, every possible cure attempted. Kenji Takeda, his father, had spared no expense. He flew in doctors from Tokyo, hired speech pathologists from London, even brought in a renowned therapist from New York. Teachers, tutors, healers. One after another, they arrived at the mansion with their charts and theories, and one after another, they left defeated, shaking their heads, bowing politely, whispering that it would take time, that not every wound can be fixed. But for Kenji, time was a luxury he had no patience for. He buried himself in his work, extending his business trips, rarely looking his son in the eyes. Perhaps he feared what he would see there, or what he wouldn't. To the other employees, Haruto became like a ghost child, quiet, drifting, always clutching books he couldn't read out loud, always hiding in corners. And so they learned to move around him, to pretend he wasn't there. Irina began to notice how even the warmest of them, the gardener, the cook, avoided his gaze, as if they too had come to believe what the doctors had said in hushed tones. Some silences can never be broken. But something in the boy's stare, those dark, watchful eyes, told her otherwise. He was not broken, only waiting. And in the quiet of her own room at night, she wondered if perhaps she had been waiting too. The library was her favorite room in the mansion, though she would never have admitted it aloud. It was quiet, yes, but not in the same suffocating way the rest of the house was. Here, the silence felt alive, humming faintly with the scent of old paper and cedar shelves. Rows of books stood neatly in their places, untouched for years, some still wrapped in protective paper bands that no one had bothered to remove. On her third evening of work, Irina was sent to clean the library while the family was away. She slipped inside, broom in one hand, and closed the shoji doors softly behind her. The warmth of the golden light spilling from the antique lanterns painted her uniform in muted amber. It felt like a sanctuary. She set down her tools, adjusted the white apron over her black dress, and began dusting the lower shelves. Her fingers traced over titles she couldn't help reading, volumes in Japanese, but also in French, German, even Russian. Something about that struck her deeply. Who in this house had purchased these books? Surely not the boy. She glanced toward the far corner, the same one she'd caught sight of him the day before, sitting cross-legged behind the reading table, empty now. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she continued cleaning. The quiet was heavy here, as though the walls were holding their breath. And so, almost without thinking, she opened her mouth and let out the smallest sound, a melody. At first it was nothing but a hum, soft and uncertain. Then the words formed on her tongue, hesitant but familiar. A lullaby in Russian, a song she hadn't sung in years. Spi moj malenki, zvezda visoko svetit dla tebya. Sleep, my little one, the star shines high for you. Her voice rose just enough to fill the space, warm and low. The sound startled even her. It reminded her of her mother's kitchen back home, of snowy winters and hands that smelled faintly of bread. It reminded her she still had a voice. She moved to another shelf, still singing softly, letting the words linger in the air as if weaving invisible threads around the room. And then, a faint sound broke her rhythm, a creak on the tatami mat. Her song faltered, and she turned slightly. There, tucked in the shadows between two towering shelves, was Haruto, watching her. His dark eyes were wide, almost frightened, but not of her. Of himself, perhaps, for having been caught listening.
For a moment, neither moved. She blinked and offered him the smallest of smiles before returning to her work as though nothing had happened. But her heart was racing, because she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. A spark, like the faintest crack of light in the corner of a locked room.
The next morning, the mansion was unusually quiet, even for its standards. Irina moved through the polished corridors with her head slightly bowed, hands folded neatly in front of her apron. Her mind was still lingering on what had happened the night before, or perhaps more precisely, what she had seen. Those eyes, that spark, it stayed with her, long after she'd left the library and retreated to the tiny servants' quarters in the back. Was it possible she'd imagined it? She pushed the thought aside as she set about her morning chores, sweeping the grand staircase and polishing the wood banister until it gleamed like water under sunlight. When it came time to dust the hall by the library, she felt the faintest twinge of nerves. Would he be there? The answer came sooner than expected. From behind her, a faint sound, barely louder than the whisper of her broom bristles. Zvezda. Irina froze mid-sweep. The word hung in the air between them like something fragile and forbidden. Zvezda. She turned slowly to find him standing at the edge of the library's threshold, small hands clutching the doorframe, eyes fixed on the floor. Her heart squeezed. The boy had spoken. Not just spoken, but repeated the word from her lullaby. Zvezda. Star. Her lips parted in quiet disbelief, and then, without thinking, she took a single step toward him. Very good, she murmured softly, this time in Japanese. Hoshi, Zvezda, star. Her voice was a thread, light enough to cross the space between them without breaking whatever spell hung over him. He glanced up for a heartbeat, startled by her tone, and she saw something in his eyes again, a flicker of pride. Encouraged, she knelt slowly on the tatami, bringing herself to his level. Étoile, she added gently, this time in French. He blinked. His lips moved again, just barely, testing the sound without quite letting it out. Irina smiled, warm and patient, and gave the faintest nod. Something unseen, yet undeniable, passed between them. For months, perhaps years, this boy had been locked inside himself, unreachable, despite all the doctors and tutors and specialists his father's money could buy. And yet here he was, whispering the word Zvezda to a stranger in a maid's uniform. She didn't need to understand why, only that he had chosen to say it to her. From somewhere deeper in the mansion, footsteps echoed, and just like that, he turned and disappeared down the hall without another sound. Irina sat back on her heels, staring after him. Her fingers brushed the broom handle at her side, though she couldn't remember letting it go. The smallest smile curved her lips. Somewhere inside this quiet, lonely house, a door had opened, and she intended to keep it open.
At first, Irina thought it might have been a fluke, that faint Zvezda she heard from Haruto the morning after her lullaby. But when she entered the library again, he was already there, sitting cross-legged on the tatami, waiting for her. He didn't say anything when she arrived, just followed her with those dark, observant eyes as she dusted the shelves and straightened the books. For days this continued, Haruto appearing silently wherever she was, in the hall, in the library, in the garden, always at a distance, but always watching. And Irina, pretending not to notice at first, began to let her own presence soften. She would hum, quietly at first, as she polished the banister. She would murmur to herself in Japanese when picking up toys from the floor, neat little words, simple and gentle. Sakura, Neko, Yuki. Then one afternoon she had an idea. While cleaning the kitchen, she tore a small piece of notepaper from a stack and wrote a single word in crisp, looping Cyrillic. Below it, she carefully printed the kanji translation, and then, in tiny Roman letters, the English word, star, hoshi, zviezda. She folded it and placed it under a porcelain vase in the library. That evening, when she returned to the library to dust, the paper was gone. The next day, she left another. Cat, Neko, Koshka. This time, when she came back, she found it resting in Haruto's lap as he sat by the window, fingers tracing each character. When he noticed her watching, he froze, but instead of running, he whispered, Neko, Koshka. Irina smiled softly. Oui, très bien, she replied in French, her voice a velvet ribbon in the still room. His mouth twitched upward, the smallest hint of a smile, and then he looked down again, but his fingers tightened on the little card as though it were something precious. From that day forward, Irina began leaving the cards everywhere, tucked into the cushions of the sofa, slipped between the pages of storybooks in the library, underneath his cup in the dining room. Always the same format: Japanese, Russian, English, sometimes a fourth word in French, and always accompanied by a small, simple drawing of the thing. Haruto began collecting them. Irina noticed he kept them in a neat little pile in his school satchel, pulling them out to practice when no one was watching. At first, he repeated the words in a whisper, but slowly, day by day, his voice grew a little louder, his tongue more confident. She watched him come alive. It was subtle at first, a faint blush in his cheeks, a spark in his eyes when he recognized a word she'd left behind. The first time he laughed, a real, unguarded laugh, was when he found a card under his pillow that read Moon, Tsuki, Luna, Lune. He ran to her in the hallway, breathless, and held the card up to her face. Luna, he exclaimed, and she could do nothing but kneel and whisper, Da, moja malenkaya Luna. Yes, my little moon. And he smiled so widely it almost hurt her to see. Meanwhile, the staff began to notice. They would glance at Haruto as he scurried through the corridors, clutching the little cards like talismans. Some of them whispered behind Irina's back, and she could feel their judgment like needles at the nape of her neck. But they said nothing to her directly. And so she continued.
The cards began to multiply. Every morning, Haruto woke up earlier, eager to find the next word she had hidden for him. Some days it was tucked into his shoes by the entrance. Other times it was balanced on the rim of his water glass at lunch. Once, he even discovered one slipped between the pages of his math homework, as though Irina had known he would need it at that exact moment. And each time when he found one, he would come find her. At first, he stood in doorways, holding the card up silently, waiting for her nod of approval. Then he began to speak the words aloud, sometimes in Russian, sometimes in Japanese, sometimes in halting English. Neko, he'd say. Shat, she'd reply. Luna, he'd whisper. Moon, she'd smile. One morning, Haruto burst into the kitchen just as she was wiping down the counter, clutching a new card tightly. Tsuki, Lune, Moon, he shouted, his cheeks flushed with excitement. Irina turned to him and feigned surprise, then clapped softly. "Perfect," she said gently, her accent thick but warm. "Absolutely perfect." The kitchen staff froze. The cook dropped a ladle into a pot, the clatter ringing through the room. The housekeeper stared openly at the boy, her lips parted. Haruto didn't seem to notice them, didn't care. He was too busy looking at Irina as though she'd just handed him the sun. But later she heard their whispers. What is she doing with him? Why does he follow her around like that? Isn't it strange, this foreign woman with her little cards? Irina ignored them all. Because Haruto was changing. He no longer walked with his head down, his steps grew quicker, lighter. He began spending more time in the library and less hiding in corners. At meals, he occasionally glanced up at his father, only for a second, but it was a start. And though Kenji never noticed, Irina did. One afternoon, she caught Haruto in the garden, arranging his collection of cards in a circle around him. He was whispering each word to himself, testing them like delicate keys in invisible locks. When he saw her watching, he stood and ran to her, thrusting a card into her hand. "Star," he said proudly in English. "Hoshi," he added in Japanese. Then softer, almost to himself. "Zvezda." Irina swallowed hard. She crouched to his level, placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, and whispered, "Very good, Haruto. You're unlocking doors no one else could." For the first time since she'd arrived, she allowed herself to feel it, that unmistakable pull in her chest, the reminder of what it felt like to teach, to guide, to witness someone awakening. But she caught herself before the memory could cut too deep, because no one here could know who she really was. Not yet. And so she smiled, patted his cheek, and stood again. "Tomorrow," she said softly, in Russian this time, "we'll find a new word, something even brighter." And Haruto, with his little stack of words clutched to his heart, nodded eagerly. Around them, the cherry blossoms fell quietly on the stones, and the other staff peeked from doorways, some with curiosity, some with disdain, but none of them dared to interrupt. Not anymore.
By the end of the second week, Haruto was no longer just following Irina with his eyes. He was following her with wonder. Every time she entered a room, something in him awakened. He would glance at the floor where she passed, hoping for one of those mysterious cards. And more often than not, she would leave one tucked beneath a pillow, behind a book, or even slipped into the sleeve of his school jacket. Each card carried a single word: hope, cat, morning, dream, written in different scripts: Cyrillic, Romaji, Kana, Latin, always with a little drawing next to it, always gentle. Haruto began whispering them back, first to himself, then softly to Irina. And with each whisper, his voice gained weight, like muscles remembering how to move. His silence had once been thick as stone, but now it cracked in places. No one else in the house understood what was happening. They saw Irina, always quiet, always in uniform, and assumed she was simply being polite. They saw Haruto, a boy once thought unreachable, smiling more, following someone, holding flashcards. A few staff members raised their eyebrows. Others glanced knowingly, but said nothing. To them, she was still just the maid. But Irina carried something no one could see. She had once stood before crowded lecture halls in Russia, her voice fluent in 5 languages, her research on childhood language acquisition cited in academic journals across Europe and Asia. She had been called gifted, visionary, brilliant. Her name had appeared on conference banners, her ideas debated in university halls. But none of that mattered after the accident. She and her husband had moved to Japan to rebuild. He dreamed of opening a translation firm. She planned to partner with local universities. But the car crash shattered those dreams in a single moment. He died instantly. Their little girl survived the crash, only to be taken from her days later when a fire tore through the hospital where she was recovering. Irina was left alone, grieving 2 losses in a country not her own, drowning in debts she couldn't pay, unable to return home. Her credentials meant nothing here. Her grief meant even less. Teaching, her first language, fell silent inside her. So she faded. She took the first job she could find, cleaning. It was simpler to be invisible, safer. And yet, when she met Haruto, a boy whose silence mirrored her own, something reawakened. Not ambition, not pride, but instinct, compassion, memory. She didn't need a classroom anymore. She only needed a hallway, a corner of a room, a child's glance. That was enough. What no one at the Takeda estate knew, not the head maid, not the chauffeur, and certainly not Kenji, was that the woman polishing their hardwood floors could speak more languages than anyone in the household combined, that she had once trained diplomats, that she had once taught joyfully until the world took everything from her. Irina didn't want recognition. She didn't want redemption. She just couldn't look away from the boy who reminded her so much of everything she had lost.
Kenji Takeda had always believed that money could fix anything. If a car broke, you replaced it. If a company faltered, you invested. If a child was silent, you hired the best doctors. Yet, over the past 2 months, something began to gnaw at him. He noticed Haruto more often now, not because he made an effort to, but because something about his son seemed different. There was a lightness in the boy's step, an unfamiliar alertness in his eyes. Where once Haruto would glide through the mansion like a pale shadow, now Kenji caught glimpses of him stopping, looking at the walls, running his fingers along the carved wood as though rediscovering the house he lived in. And every time, she was there. Irina. At first, Kenji thought it was coincidence, the maid simply doing her rounds wherever Haruto happened to be. But the more he watched, the more deliberate it looked. Always at a respectful distance, always silent, yet always present. He began to hear faint sounds at odd times, soft laughter, a low voice, not quite loud enough to catch the words, coming from behind a door. Once, crossing the hallway late at night, he heard a faint bonjour whispered somewhere down the corridor, followed by a small giggle he almost didn't recognize as his son's. Kenji didn't intervene, not yet. Instead, he began to watch more closely. One evening, returning early from a meeting, he found himself standing at the threshold of the library, the heavy door slightly ajar. The glow of a warm lamp spilled into the hallway, and the scent of tatami and polish hung in the air. Inside, he heard voices. It stopped him cold. Voices, plural. And then he heard his own son's voice. At first, he doubted it.
Maybe it was Irina speaking alone. Maybe it was an echo. But no. As he pressed closer, he heard the boy's small, hesitant tones, answering her. In words. In words he didn't even recognize. Kenji's pulse quickened. He didn't know whether to barge in or remain frozen. The sound of Haruto's laughter, faint, shy, but unmistakably alive, locked him in place. Through the sliver of the door, he saw them sitting cross-legged on the tatami. Cards were scattered between them, each with neat little characters written on them. Irina would slide one forward and say a word, sometimes in Japanese, sometimes in another language. Haruto would repeat it, slowly but surely, his small hands clutching the cards like precious treasures. And then it happened. The boy looked up from the cards, his dark eyes sparkling, and turned toward the door without realizing his father was there. "Oto-san," he said softly. Kenji's pulse caught in his chest. The boy's voice, his son's voice, spoken directly, clearly. And for the first time in years, the boy smiled. Kenji pushed the door open fully now, revealing himself. Irina froze, startled, and quickly rose to her knees, lowering her gaze. Haruto glanced between them, still clutching the card in his fingers. Kenji stared at her, searching for words, but all that came out was her name, almost reverent, almost a whisper. Irina. At first, Kenji truly saw her. Kenji stood there for a long moment, his hand still resting on the doorframe, his eyes locked on Irina. The boy had scurried to a corner with his cards, sensing the sudden weight in the room, but staying close enough to listen. "Why didn't you tell me?" Kenji finally asked, his voice low but sharp. Irina straightened her back where she knelt on the tatami, her hands still resting lightly on her apron. Her eyes met his without fear. "Because you never asked," she answered, her tone calm, almost gentle. Kenji blinked at her, the words cutting deeper than he expected. He took a hesitant step into the room, his polished shoes clicking against the wood before sinking into the soft mat. "You mean to say, all this time you were teaching him, and no one thought to inform me?" His voice cracked slightly at the end. Irina tilted her head ever so slightly, her expression neutral but steady. "I wasn't hiding," she said. "I was here, every day, on this floor, in this room, saying the words he wanted to hear. And no one told you," she added softly, "because you were never here to listen." That last sentence hung between them, heavy as stone. Kenji's jaw tightened, and he finally lowered himself to sit on the edge of the low reading bench, his elbows on his knees. "You presume much," he muttered, but it sounded hollow even to himself. Irina's lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile, sad, understanding. "Someone had to," she murmured. "He reached out to me, Takeda-sama, not the other way around." Kenji wubbed his hands over his face, staring at the floor, as if the answer might be written there. "I hired the best doctors, the best therapists, specialists from Tokyo, New York, and you—" He stopped, shaking his head. "And yet," Irina finished softly, "none of them sat on the floor with him and listened." Kenji looked up at her then, his eyes unexpectedly bright. "So, you're saying this is my fault?" His voice was smaller now, almost a whisper. "I'm saying," Irina replied, "he was waiting for someone to see him, not to diagnose him, not to fix him, just to stay." The words settled like dust in the quiet room. Kenji stared at the bookshelves lining the walls, at the small boy now watching them both from behind a stack of picture books, and for the first time in years he saw, not just the child, but himself reflected in that silence. After a long moment, he nodded faintly, more to himself than to her. Irina rose gracefully, smoothing her apron, and offered a polite bow. "If you wish me to stop," she said softly, "say the word. But he is speaking now, Takeda-sama. Not because of me, because you left a space where someone else had to step in." Kenji remained seated on the bench, silent, watching her walk out of the library. The next morning, the air in the Takeda mansion felt heavier than usual. The golden light pouring through the shoji doors could not warm the subtle chill that had settled among the staff. Whispers rose and fell like waves behind Irina's back as she moved through the corridors. It had been over 2 months now since her arrival, and Haruto's transformation was undeniable. He spoke, softly at first, then with growing confidence. He mixed Japanese with careful English phrases, sometimes shyly asking her the word in Russian before repeating it with pride. His laughter, once unthinkable, now drifted through the halls like a fragile melody. But not everyone celebrated this change. From the corner of the dining room, Akiyama, the head housekeeper, watched Irina wipe down the polished surface of a sideboard with quiet precision. Akiyama's lips pressed into a thin line. She had been in this house for more than 15 years. She had watched Haruto's mother die, and she had watched Kenji bury himself in work. To her, this was her domain, and she had always believed that no one, certainly not a foreign maid, understood what was best for the boy better than she did. And yet, in the past 2 months, Haruto had stopped clinging to her skirts, had stopped hiding behind her when strangers arrived. He barely even noticed her anymore. His eyes were always searching for Irina. Later that day, she cornered Kenji in his office. He sat at his desk, sleeves rolled up, reviewing contracts, his mind elsewhere. "Forgive me for intruding, Takeda-sama," she began, her voice polite but tinged with steel. Kenji glanced up, mildly surprised. "What is it, Akiyama-san?" She took a measured breath before continuing. "It is about the maid, Irina." He set his pen down. "What about her?" "She has overstepped." His brow furrowed slightly, but he said nothing, so she pressed on. "She spends too much time with Haruto-sama, beyond her duties. She sits on the floor with him, speaks to him in strange languages, leaves little papers around the house. It may seem harmless now, but—" "Harmless?" Kenji interrupted, his tone sharper than he intended. Akiyama faltered, but quickly regained her footing. "It is not her place to take on such a role, Takeda-sama. She is confusing him, making him dependent. You hired her to clean, not to interfere with the boy's upbringing." Kenji leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Is that all?" he asked finally, his voice quiet. Akiyama hesitated, sensing she may have gone too far, but nodded. He waved his hand dismissively. "You may go." But as she bowed and left, Kenji's eyes remained fixed on the papers before him, though he no longer saw them. He pictured the library the night before, Haruto's face lit with joy, his son speaking his name again after years of silence. Something inside him tightened. And yet Akiyama's words echoed faintly in his mind. She is confusing him. It is not her place.
The next day, the mansion's quiet routine continued on the surface, but beneath it, tension simmered. Akiyama's words had planted seeds of doubt, however faint, in Kenji's mind. He found himself standing outside the library door that afternoon, fingers curled loosely around the frame, listening. Inside, the familiar murmur of Irina's voice floated through the air, soft and rhythmic, alternating between Russian and English. Then came Haruto's laugh, bright, unrestrained, followed by his own halting words in a mixture of languages. Kenji stayed there longer than he intended, caught between awe and discomfort. When the moment finally broke, he pushed the door open just enough to see them. Irina crouched next to Haruto on the tatami, holding a small stack of cards, her smile patient and warm. The boy sat cross-legged, repeating words after her, his hands playing with one of the cards, which read Tomodachi, friend, in neat, careful strokes. Neither of them noticed Kenji. Later, he summoned Akiyama to his office again. "She does not seem to be hurting him," he said when she appeared. His voice was low, almost to himself. "No," Akiyama admitted reluctantly, "but it is not proper. Takeda-sama, the boy is growing attached to her, too attached. She may leave one day, and then what happens? He will fall apart again. He needs stability, not—" She trailed off, searching for the right word. "Not illusions." Kenji stared out the window for a long time, the faint sound of rain beginning to patter against the glass. "She is not an illusion," he said, finally, his tone flat but final. But still, that night, as he lay awake in his vast, empty room, he couldn't ignore Akiyama's last words. What if she leaves? The thought unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. The next morning, he entered the library earlier than usual and found Irina dusting the shelves. Haruto was not there yet. She looked up at him calmly when he spoke. "Irina, I need to understand, what exactly are you doing with my son?" She set down the duster and straightened, her expression serene but unreadable. "I am giving him what he needs," she said simply. He blinked at her. "And what is that?" Irina's eyes met his without flinching. "A reason to speak, someone to listen. Not a title, not a therapy, just a person." Kenji stood there silent, as though her words had taken the air out of the room. He had no rebuttal. After a long moment, he nodded faintly and left the room without another word, though her quiet conviction lingered with him all day.
That night, after the tension with Akiyama, the mansion fell into an unusual hush. Even the housekeepers tread lightly, as though afraid to disturb whatever fragile balance Irina had somehow created. Kenji retreated to his study, but didn't work. He sat in his chair, staring out at the dark garden beyond the shoji doors, the faint glow of the moon catching on the koi pond. Haruto was already asleep, clutching one of Irina's handwritten cards to his chest. The next morning, Kenji asked to see Irina privately. She entered the library quietly, but with steady steps, her maid's uniform immaculate, her expression calm but unreadable. He was already there, standing near the window where golden morning light poured in. For a moment, he simply studied her, really studied her, as though seeing her for the first time. The quiet authority in her posture, the intelligence in her eyes, the hands that carried no arrogance, only patience. "Sit," he finally said. Irina obeyed without a word, folding her hands neatly in her lap. The silence stretched so long that she almost thought he'd changed his mind. Instead, his voice came, low and controlled. "Who are you, Irina, really?" She did not flinch. She did not avert her gaze. But she did take a slow breath, as though choosing each word carefully. "What do you want to know, Takeda-san?" "Everything. Why you came here. Why my son can speak to you, but not to anyone else? Why you've hidden whatever it is you've been hiding?" Irina lowered her eyes for the first time that morning, not in shame, but as if to look inward, to find the right place to begin. She unfolded her story in pieces, her accent thickening softly with each memory. She and her husband had come to Japan years earlier, full of plans. He dreamed of opening a translation firm. She intended to collaborate with universities. They had a little girl, too, bright and full of questions. But one rainy winter night, her husband's car had spun out of control on the expressway. He was killed instantly. Irina woke in a hospital bed days later to find herself a widow, her daughter in critical condition after an unrelated fire in the hospital's children's ward. The girl hadn't survived. "After that," Irina murmured, her voice cracking ever so slightly, "everything I had, my work, my name, my country, they became irrelevant. I had debts. I couldn't go home. My degrees meant nothing here, and my grief even less. Teaching became impossible, so I stopped." Kenji's throat tightened as he listened, but he said nothing. "When I came to this house, I did not intend to teach again. I only meant to survive. But then, Haruto, he reminded me." There was no pride in her tone, no trace of self-pity, just a quiet, unassailable truth. Kenji remained still, his jaw tense, his hands clasped behind his back. The words he intended to speak dissolved on his tongue. For the first time, he understood not just what she had done for Haruto, but what Haruto had done for her.
Kenji stood there for a long moment, staring at Irina as though her words had cracked something inside him wide open. He had expected excuses, perhaps even defiance, but what he received was truth, and it was heavy. He turned away briefly, pretending to study the bookshelves, but really just needing a moment to collect himself. "You should have told me sooner," he said at last, his voice low, though not as sharp as before. Irina tilted her head slightly. "And if I had? Would you have listened, Takeda-san?" That stopped him cold, because he already knew the answer. For months, years even, he'd told himself he was providing everything his son could possibly need. Doctors, therapists, private tutors. He had built a fortress of luxury and professionals around Haruto, never realizing that the boy only needed to be seen, to be understood. And in his absence, Irina had done what he, with all his wealth and power, could not. "You weren't supposed to fix this," Kenji muttered, more to himself than to her. Irina's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, not cruel, not smug, but knowing. Sometimes it is the ones you do not expect who see what others cannot. He turned away briefly, pretending to study the bookshelves, but really just needing a moment to collect himself. "You should have told me sooner," he said at last, his voice low, though not as sharp as before. Irina tilted her head slightly. "And if I had? Would you have listened, Takeda-san?" That stopped him cold, because he already knew the answer. For months, years even, he'd told himself he was providing everything his son could possibly need: doctors, therapists, private tutors. He had built a fortress of luxury and professionals around Haruto, never realizing that the boy only needed to be seen, to be understood. And in his absence, Irina had done what he, with all his wealth and power, could not. "You weren't supposed to fix this," Kenji muttered, more to himself than to her. Irina's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, not cruel, not smug, but knowing. Sometimes it is the ones you do not expect who see what others cannot. He finally sat down opposite her, his shoulders heavy, his face unreadable, but softer than it had been in months. "What you've done for my son, I cannot repay. It was not a debt. He gave me back something too, a reason." Kenji looked down at his hands. For the first time in a long time, he felt the tight knot in his chest loosen, just a little. "What would you have me do now?" he asked quietly. Irina regarded him for a moment before answering, her voice as steady as ever. "See him, not as a project, not as a failure, not as a reflection of yourself. Just see him." Those words hung between them like a quiet verdict. Kenji finally nodded. "And you?" he asked, glancing up at her. "What do you want?" Irina thought for a long time before replying. "Only this, that he grows up in peace, that he is allowed to speak on his own terms, and that no one calls him a miracle. He is simply a boy who is waiting to be heard." For the first time in years, Kenji allowed himself to look directly at her, really look, and in that moment, he finally understood the depth of what had been happening right under his nose. "Then stay," he said finally, his voice firm now, "but not as a maid, as whatever he needs you to be." Irina inclined her head, and though she did not smile, her eyes softened. "If that is what he wants, then I will." Kenji rose then, offering her a small but genuine bow, the kind a man reserves for someone he can no longer pretend is invisible. For the first time since his wife's death, he felt the heavy silence in the mansion shift, and somewhere upstairs, Haruto stirred in his sleep, clutching another one of her handwritten cards, as though he already knew that something had quietly changed.
The Takeda mansion was no longer silent. The change came quietly at first, like the faint scent of plum blossoms before the spring. But over the weeks following that pivotal conversation in the library, it became impossible to ignore. Haruto began to fill the house with his voice. It wasn't just the words, though those were miraculous enough. It was the way he moved now, no longer hugging the walls like a ghost. He walked through the hallways with a quiet confidence, clutching one of Irina's handmade cards or a notebook in his hands. The tatami mats creaked under his feet, and once the entire staff paused at the sound of his laughter echoing down the stairs. He spoke to the gardener, in English, asking about the plum trees in the courtyard. He spoke to the cook in French, complimenting the taste of the croissants she sometimes snuck to him. And once, as Irina watched from the doorway, he even called out "arigato" to the delivery man at the gate, his voice shy but proud. Kenji, too, began to change, though not as quickly. At first, he simply watched. From a distance, leaning on a door frame or standing in the shadows of the hallway. He would find himself stopping mid-email, his laptop still open, but his eyes fixed on the sight of his son playing a word game on the library floor with Irina, their heads bowed close over a scatter of cards in Japanese, English, and Russian. It unsettled him, and yet it also disarmed him. One evening, he entered the library earlier than usual and found Haruto and Irina arranging colorful cards on the low table. Haruto was reading a word aloud, carefully, his pronunciation delicate, and Irina smiled, gently correcting him before letting him try again. The boy giggled when he finally got it right. Kenji froze, realizing it had been years since he'd heard that sound. That night, instead of retreating to his study as he usually did, Kenji sat down on the opposite side of the library and simply stayed, listening, watching. For the first time in years, he began having dinner at the long dining room table instead of eating in his office. At first, Haruto looked startled when his father joined them, but slowly, as the weeks passed, the boy would glance up from his plate, offering a hesitant smile before returning to his food. Irina noticed the way Kenji now lingered just a little longer in each room, the way his eyes softened whenever Haruto spoke. The staff noticed too. There were murmurs in the kitchen about how the boy no longer avoided eye contact, how he sometimes even offered to help clear the plates in English. But no one dared say much aloud. It was as if they all sensed something fragile was at work, something sacred that shouldn't be disturbed. For Irina, these days felt like a quiet redemption. Every morning she still tied her apron with the same care, still swept the same polished floors, still moved through the same marble corridors with quiet respect. But inside, she felt alive again. Haruto's progress, his laughter, his determination, his gentle voice in 3, sometimes 4 languages, reminded her of who she had once been, of the woman who stood in lecture halls and wrote her name on chalkboards, of the mother who sang lullabies to a baby girl who would never grow up, of the wife who had once believed she belonged somewhere. And now, here she was, belonging again, in a place that had no words for what she had given. The mansion no longer felt like a mausoleum. It felt, impossibly, like home.
Spring arrived fully at the Takeda mansion. The cherry blossoms opened outside the shoji doors in soft, fleeting clouds of pink. Petals drifted onto the veranda, catching in Haruto's hair as he sat outside with Irina, tracing kanji characters into a notebook. Kenji stood behind the screen door, watching them. He no longer tried to hide it, no longer pretended he wasn't paying attention. There was something about the way Haruto now looked up at Irina that broke and healed him all at once. That evening, Kenji called the head housekeeper, Akiyama, into his study. "Have you noticed?" he asked quietly, gesturing vaguely toward the window. Akiyama hesitated before nodding. "Yes, Takeda-sama, everyone has." Kenji pressed his hands flat on the desk, staring down at the grain of the wood. Himself again. Or maybe for the first time, he murmured. For weeks now, Kenji had been learning to linger in the quiet moments. He'd begun arriving home earlier, closing his laptop more often, sitting at the table with his son, even just to listen. One morning, he found Haruto alone in the garden, holding a card Irina had written. In Russian, then English, then Japanese, Haruto read the word aloud. Home. Kenji's throat tightened. Irina, too, had changed in subtle but undeniable ways. She still wore the uniform, still kept her hair in its tidy bun, still moved with that graceful restraint. But there was a lightness to her now, a spark in her pale blue eyes that had been missing when she first arrived. In quiet moments, she would stand outside on the veranda, looking at the cherry blossoms, her fingers curled around the edges of her apron, as if she were holding something invisible and precious. The staff began treating her differently as well. Some still watched her with suspicion, especially Akiyama, but others began to greet her more warmly. One of the junior maids even asked her shyly how to say good morning in French. Irina obliged, of course, with a small smile. By the end of the second month, the mansion felt entirely transformed. The walls no longer seemed to echo emptily. The air no longer felt heavy. On a quiet night near the end of April, Kenji found himself pausing at the entrance to the library again. Inside, Haruto sat cross-legged on the tatami mat, a circle of cards spread before him. Irina knelt beside him, encouraging him gently as he practiced aloud. Star, étoile, hoshi, zviezda. Each word came softer, but more confident than the last. Kenji watched his son smile, watched his shoulders relax, watched him point to the word in each language, and then turn his face expectantly, proudly toward her. Something inside Kenji fractured, then mended. Later that evening, after Haruto had gone to bed, Kenji walked past the library again. Irina was still there, collecting the cards into neat stacks. She looked up when she saw him. "You've changed this house," Kenji said simply. Irina's hands froze over the cards for a briefest moment. Then she shook her head and answered softly, "No, he did." Kenji didn't argue, but as he turned away, he thought, "And so did you." The mansion had become something else now, something alive, and for the first time in years, Kenji felt he could breathe inside it. The day of the ceremony arrived beneath a sky the color of porcelain. Kenji's car pulled up in front of an elegant theater in the heart of Tokyo, its wooden facade restored to perfection, golden lanterns swaying faintly in the spring breeze. A discreet banner announced the launch of the Takeda Foundation's new educational initiative, a program dedicated to supporting children with trauma-induced speech loss. Kenji stepped out first, immaculate in his tailored navy suit, his expression a calm mask that only faintly betrayed the weight of the moment. The crowd inside the theater was hushed, dignitaries and journalists whispering to one another as they took their seats. Somewhere near the front, a small podium waited, and behind it, a boy stood, too small for the microphone, yet perfectly composed in his dark school uniform. Haruto. Next to him, Irina knelt slightly, adjusting the lapels of his jacket, murmuring something only he could hear. When she stood back, Kenji finally saw her properly. She was no longer wearing the maid uniform, instead a modest navy dress, simple but elegant, her light brown hair in its usual bun, though a few loose strands framed her face. Her icy blue eyes seemed even brighter under the theater lights. Irina gave Haruto's shoulder a gentle squeeze and stepped aside. The audience fell silent. Haruto looked out over the room, clutching a small stack of cards in his hands. He adjusted the microphone as best he could. For a moment, he only breathed. Then, softly but clear enough for everyone to hear, "Good evening. My name is Haruto Takeda." A ripple moved through the crowd. The boy's voice, that had once been silent for years, filled the room, steady and alive. "For a long time, I couldn't speak, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how anymore. Everyone tried to fix me, but no one listened. Kenji stood in the wings, hands clasped behind his back, throat tight. Haruto's fingers tightened on the cards. He lifted his chin slightly. Then she came, and she didn't tell me to talk. She talked to me, and listened to me, even when I couldn't answer. One word at a time, she gave me my voice back. In Japanese, in English, in Russian, in French, and in Spanish. At each language, he spoke the word for thank you, letting it roll off his tongue with pride. The room swelled with quiet awe. Finally, he turned his head toward the side of the stage, toward her, and said, "Irina, you saw me when no one else did. Thank you." The theater erupted in applause. Irina stood frozen for a moment, her hands at her sides, before she allowed herself a small, warm smile. And for the first time in years, Kenji clapped too, not as a father ashamed of his absence, but as a man finally seeing what had been before him all along. The applause lingered like a warm tide that refused to recede. Irina stood at the side of the stage, her hands lightly clasped in front of her, feeling her chest rise and fall as though every breath carried years of silence and sorrow away. The boy, Haruto, stepped back from the podium, his cheeks flushed with pride. He turned and walked toward her, slipping his small hand into hers without hesitation. Kenji approached slowly from the other side, his steps deliberate, his eyes fixed on the woman before him. He stopped only a foot away, his voice low but audible above the fading applause. "Irina." There was no anger now, no confusion, only something softer, almost reverent. She inclined her head slightly, her smile modest but steady. Kenji glanced down at his son, who was still clutching her hand, and then back at her. His own voice faltered. You gave him back to me." Irina shook her head gently, her voice quiet yet firm. "No, he was always here. He just needed someone to wait long enough to hear him." A hush fell over the stage as a reporter stepped forward timidly, microphone in hand. "Miss Irina, would you care to say a few words?" For the briefest moment, panic flashed in her icy blue eyes. The instinct to remain invisible was hard to break, but Haruto squeezed her hand as though granting her permission. She took a deep breath, stepped forward, and faced the sea of expectant faces. "I was not hired to teach. I was hired to clean floors no one notices, to polish wood no one touches, to be invisible. But he," she glanced at Haruto, "saw me, and I saw him." She paused, her throat tightening. "People think language is only words, but language is connection. It's noticing the quiet, listening between the silences. That's all I did. I listened, and he found his voice." Her gaze swept the room, taking in the parents, the children, the officials, all holding their breath. You don't heal a child by fixing them. You heal them by seeing them, truly seeing them, with your heart. As she stepped back, the applause rose again, louder now, with people standing, some wiping their eyes, others murmuring her name. From the corner of her vision, Irina noticed cherry blossom petals drift through an open window, catching the stage lights as they fell. She thought, not without a quiet ache, "I never imagined I would be seen again." Beside her, Haruto smiled shyly, whispering just for her, "Thank you, Irina." She squeezed his hand back and whispered in Russian, "Always." Kenji, still watching them both, finally bowed his head, not as an heir of a dynasty, but as a man humbled. And as the ceremony drew to a close, Irina stood tall, feeling the weight of her grief lift just enough to let her breathe. For the first time in years, she believed again in the quiet power of being seen and seeing. If this story touched your heart as much as it touched ours, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. Leave a like to help us share this message further, and tell us in the comments what you thought of Irina and Haruto's journey, and where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story too. Thank you for watching. Until the next story,